I've never had anybody like twist my arm and tell me I have to vote a certain way. In fact, it's kind of ironic when I'm here, I have a lot of people say, are you tough enough to stand up to leadership? But then they don't want me to be tough enough to stand up to them. They want me to just do whatever they think I should do, but I should be independent-minded when it comes to leadership in Washington, D.C. I'm trying to make sure that I'm being tough and independent-minded with everybody and doing what I think is best for the people of the 2nd District, no matter what kind of pressure I get.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the 435 podcast. I'm your host, Robert Macfarlane, and I have Jazzy Jeff Watkins riding shotgun. He makes an appearance here today, but we have Celeste Maloy. She's back for our second time talking about what she's been doing in Congress. There's been several votes, appropriation bills, defense spending, TikTok, all kinds of stuff that's been passed while she's been sitting in the CD2 seat, but she's back up for re-election. So we talk a little bit about what she's fighting for us here in the District 2. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Hope you get a lot out of it. We get into the weeds a little bit so we can really understand what she's thinking about when she goes into these votes. So enjoy this one, guys. Big shout out to FS Coffee Co. Their grand opening, I believe, is April 6th, but they're our brand partners. We want to make sure that we're promoting local businesses here in St. George. So if you're a local business and you want to be featured here on the 435 podcast, let us know, and we'll do our best to make sure we give you a shout out. So shout out to FS Coffee Co., downtown St. George, right there at the Circle. Go check them out. They have fresh roasted coffee. It's delicious. Anyway, enjoy the episode, guys. We'll see you out there. So the campaigning, you just kind of go straight into it. You don't. There's no rest in there. It's got to be. No. It's got to be difficult to go that route.
It's tiring. I try to make sure I'm really responsive, that I show up everywhere, that people are seeing me. I don't want to be one of those people that they saw me when I was campaigning. Now that I'm in, they don't see me. Mm-hmm. So it means I keep up a really brisk pace all the time. But I like it. It's good. Yeah. And I think that's the way it should be done, so I'm going to keep doing it. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of just keeps you on your toes a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and if I'm not showing up places, if I'm not talking to the people I represent, I'm going to lose touch with what they want and how they feel. So I'm making sure that I'm there, looking people in the eye as often as I possibly can. Yeah, I've noticed,
and I was telling you before, you hit a lot of the different podcasts.
Yeah.
The circuit, at least the Utah circuit as it is.
Yeah.
It seems like, from political talking points in Utah, there wasn't really anything. Like we started May is a full year.
Okay.
And there was really only like 2 that covered anything in Utah. And then now there's a bunch. There's so many.
They do seem to be proliferating. I started campaigning last June, so I'm about as old as your podcast is as far as politics go.
There you go.
And I think I get a new request every other week or so from a podcast in Utah, which I think is a good thing. Yeah. Nobody trusts the mainstream media anymore, and everybody wonders where to get their news. And local podcasts are a pretty good way to get, original source type information where somebody's talking to a local person about the issues that are local.
Yeah. And some of them, like me, is like, I don't really know a whole lot. I do some research sometimes. Sometimes I do a lot of research. Like I had Derek Brown on, and I had to do a bunch of research for the AG role because I just had no idea really what it was. I just never taken the time to like learn about it. And so I did a bunch of research on that. And then like going into today, knowing, different bills that are being passed, there's just so much. It's tough to keep up on, which is why we have the system that we have, because everybody's just trying to live their life, right?
Yeah.
There's, your role exists because not everybody can keep up with everything.
Well, and I think most people would like to pay less attention to Congress. I think if we were doing our job really well, people could just live their lives and, be going to family reunions and their kids' soccer games and not thinking about what Congress is doing. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, it's my job to be constantly reporting back to people what I'm doing so they know what their congressman's doing, even if they don't care that much about what Congress is doing.
Yeah. So looking at just last campaign season and heading into this one, we just got done with the Washington County, nomination convention for the Republican Party. You've done more in the past, right? Because you work with Chris Stewart. This isn't your first rodeo. Has a lot of things changed in the last 5 years, or is it pretty? This is kind of the way that it goes.
No, things have changed. Something's happening in our country.
That was the first convention I'd ever been to.
Oh, really?
And so I was just trying to absorb like what was happening,
No, I've done a lot of them. And And the level of intensity that people come into those with ebbs and flows depending on what's happening. But I think just the average level of intensity is higher than it used to be. It still goes like this, but maybe it used to go up and down and the lows were lower, and now we're just higher and higher. The pitch is getting higher and higher. People are really engaged. I think we're going through some fundamental changes in our country, and everybody can feel that something's changing. So they're really engaged. Everybody wants to be really involved in who we are on the other end of those changes. Mm-hmm. Also, I'm just going to say I'm kind of congested with all the spring. Everything's in blossom.
You sound great.
Every once in a while, my voice may catch, and I will be having to take a sip every once in a while.
No, that's okay. That's all right. That the spring's blooming down here in southern Utah. You guys still got a couple months up north if you're listening in.
Well, I was on the southern border 2 days ago down in Arizona.
Really? Yeah.
And everything's in bloom down there, and it was really windy. So it's the combination of pollen and wind.
Yeah. Where in Arizona?
Sierra Vista.
Sierra Vista?
Yeah.
Interesting. So give me a report. Give me a report.
It was really interesting. So I was at the Texas border in January. Uh-huh. And when
like
I was
El Paso?
there at Eagle Point.
Eagle Point.
Pass. Sorry.
Eagle Pass.
Eagle Point is a ski resort in Beaver.
Yeah, that's right.
Eagle Pass, which is much less fun.
Yeah.
But I went down there with a large contingency of members of Congress. Uh-huh. And, there were 65 of us and the Speaker of the House. And so it was a very kind of curated experience.
Controlled
there.
Environment.
I wanted to go back when there was less of a circus and it was more authentic. And so I worked with some of our local sheriffs here in Utah and one of the sheriffs down there on the border and went. And I'd also heard that the Arizona border is very different than the Texas border as far as what they're dealing with. And it's true. When we were in Texas, they're mostly dealing with people who come across the border and surrender. They want asylum. They just want to get here. When I was at the Arizona border, they're dealing a lot more with smugglers. They're dealing with people who come across the border with drugs and go back, and then come across the border with drugs and go back, or smuggling people across the border and going back.
Do you think that there's something, is there a reason why?
I don't know for sure.
Just cartels controlling the different areas? And
yeah,
that kind
I think
of thing?
it has to do with which cartels control which parts of the border and what they make most of their money on.
Yeah. Man, it's so wild. It seems crazy. I just follow it on X, formerly known as Twitter, as they all say. And it just seems like insanity. The whole thing is just so crazy.
Oh, it is.
And we've had decades to try and solve this problem, and Congress and the executive branch, they're just not doing anything about it. They just can't can't figure out how to come to a consensus on how to deal with it.
I'm going to push back on that just a little bit.
Okay.
You're not wrong that Congress can't figure it out, but we've done a better job than the executive branch has. So
agreed.
The executive branch has a lot of tools they're not using. Yeah. We could re-implement Remain in Mexico. We could actually enforce the parole rule. We have laws on the books that the administration is just not enforcing. I think we probably still need some more legislation to tighten that up. But the House passed H.R. 2. The Senate hasn't taken it up. Even without either bill, the House bill or the Senate bill, we could have so much more control at the border than we have. What we don't have is an administration that's willing to enforce or use the tools they already have.
Yeah, which from all the polls and things I've heard, everybody's frustrated with it. So it seems odd to me that the administration hasn't, stepped up to the plate, even though it's the fourth quarter, right? At least from my perspective with them is unless they're just fully counting on that Biden's going to walk away with the election and he's going to have another 4 years to do it, it just seems like in this moment, the entire country has some pretty solid consensus that something needs to be done, and they're not doing it. And
you would think whoever's running his reelection campaign would look at these polls and see that this is the most uniting issue right now in the country.
Right.
What everyone agrees on is that the border is broken.
Yeah.
And they're not changing their policies at all. I would have thought in this year leading up to the election, they would start enforcing some rules on the border just to get reelected.
Yeah.
And they're not even doing that.
They're just filing lawsuits against Texas to stop them from taking things into their own hand, which is crazy.
And states shouldn't have to do this. Right. I mean, when the federal government fails and a state's willing to step up and do it, I want to have their back. Yeah. But they shouldn't have to do it. This is clearly a federal role.
Yeah.
And that was a lot of what we talked about in Arizona. They're really frustrated because local law enforcement is doing a lot of the work that they need federal law enforcement to do. And I said, what do you need the most? And they said policy changes.
So one of the things I hear that feels like propaganda to me is, I keep hearing this over and over, is that it's military-aged men.
Yeah.
And then, like, that's the majority.
Yeah.
And when I watch the videos, I'm like, it seems like there's some guys, but it also seems like they're separating them, where they're like, if you're not a family, you go over in that line. And then if you're a family, you go over in that line. And then they only film the one with all the guys. Like, that's in my mind, I'm like, they keep saying this thing, but I see a bunch of women and children right there, but I only ever get this, like, panning of a line that's only all men. I'm like, aren't they? I think they're just separating them out.
So you're right that they do separate them when they process them. But also, I wondered about that too, if it's a lot of propaganda that it's military-age men. And I think it depends on where you are on the border. So when I was in Texas, they do have a lot of families coming across there. They also have a lot of military-age men, and they do separate them because they don't want to house a bunch of young adult men with a bunch of women and kids for reasons I probably don't
and
have to explain
processing times
to you.
and all those other things. It makes sense.
But when I was in Arizona, I mean, these are local sheriff's deputies that are saying it's military-age men coming across this border.
Yeah.
And they're not Mexican military-age men for the most part. They're from Africa. They're from China. I mean, we also have the South American and Mexican, Hispanic males that are coming across. But the ones that they seemed really concerned about are the ones that are coming from other parts of the world because they know there's a weak spot there they can get through. And what is it they're coming through for?
Yeah.
They're coming into the country. They're disappearing into the population. We don't know where they are, how to track them. And they're not here to pick peaches or to frame up houses. What is it that they're coming here for?
Yeah, we've always had this huge advantage of two oceans separating us from, quote unquote adversaries.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem like that's going to be a problem to overcome, especially with the different types of warfare that I think are on the around the corner. But I'm going to stay away from that conversation because that's not as fun. I guess it's also a little bit morbid. Don't want to really talk about it. But I think the border is an important thing, and I know there's only so much that a single congressman can do, right? When it comes to that in this big decision-making process and all the things that are required of you. As you've gone through this first kind of round of bills, going through this legislative session, what's different to you about this legislative session than in the past? Because Congress is a slim majority with the Republicans. Maybe walk me through. Is there different negotiations? How are those happening? I mean,
so Congress isn't like the state where we have the legislative session that lasts 45 days and then you've got a big break. We're in session 3 out of 4 weeks of the month usually. And so I've only been in office for just almost 4 months. I haven't quite hit my 4-month mark. So I was a staffer during the last Congress, and I've only been a member during this Congress. So I'm not comparing apples to apples here, but I'll give you my sense. We do have such a slim majority in the House that a lot of times we expend a lot of our energy on each other in the Republican conference. We all agree that we don't want bad ideas coming from the other side of the aisle to be implemented. But we end up spending a lot of our time fighting over matters of degree on our side of the aisle. We want cuts, but are we willing to go for a 5% cut, or does it have to be a 10% cut? And we want more regular order. Does it have to be exact, perfect regular order, or are we willing to take steps toward regular order? That's what we spend a lot of our time on. And I don't think that was as much the case last Congress or the one before. And it's frustrating to be part of this process, but I do think it's a good sign that we're moving in the right direction. If the pitched battles we're having are over the process of how we pass laws and what kind of accountability we should have to the public, I think those are the questions we should have been asking for a long time. I think those are the discussions that are going to move us to where people don't have to think as much about what Congress is doing, because we're doing our business in the sunlight. We're doing our business in a way that people can look at it and see what we're doing, and you don't have to be an insider to understand what bills mean.
I don't know. I felt like that was still the case with this round. I still felt like we're operating in a little bit of a fugazi, right? So
Okay.
thinking of like going back to regular order. Maybe explain that a little bit deeper, like regular order versus not. Because I did a little bit of research just on how long have we been passing. I think there's 12. Are there 12 appropriation bills, right? And we've passed 6 so far.
We've actually passed all 12.
Okay.
So what we did this year is All 12 appropriations bills.
Clearly, I didn't do enough research.
No, it's all right. This is what I'm talking about, though. You have to be an insider to understand it, and
Yeah.
that's what I want to move away from.
Yeah.
What we did this year is our appropriations committees moved 12 bills individually through committee. So they were drafted by Republican subcommittee chairs. They had hearings, they had markups, members of Congress had a chance to amend them. So we had 12 appropriations bills that were going through regular order. And then when it got down to time to vote on them, we didn't. We passed a CR to give us more time because the Senate.
A continuing resolution.
A continuing resolution, yeah. And I voted against every continuing resolution that's come up while I've been a member of the House. I just don't think it's a good way to do business. We're required by the Constitution to pass a budget.
Right.
These spending bills are part of that process. But when we got to the point of voting on the spending bills, what we did is put 6 of them into one bill and the other 6 into another bill. I would have rather take 6 individual votes. But when people are saying there are these thousands of page bills and no one knows what's in them, that's disingenuous to say because they're made up of 6 bills that have been through regular order. We should have gotten them across the finish line in regular order. But we are moving in the direction we need to be moving on with these. And I voted yes on both of them, and I know that's been controversial. So let's talk about it because I would much rather talk about it so that people have good information. And maybe they'll still disagree with my decision, but at least they'll know how I got there. So for starters, Mike Johnson is the most conservative Speaker of the House we've had in my lifetime. He's in there fighting for these conservative wins. And we got some really important wins in those bills. And I thought if we went into a shutdown scenario, we'd never be able to come out of a shutdown with those wins still intact.
Okay, pause real quick. The shutdown scenario. So when I was reading on the budget resolutions, if a budget resolution is not passed, that the funding is basically just defaulted into the previous resolution that is extended that has a 10-year window. There's you have a projected amount over 10 years is typically what these resolutions are. Am I understanding that correctly?
I'm not sure you are. So if we have a continuing resolution, then we're still operating on last year's budget. But this time around, we negotiated for last year's budget with a 1% cut.
Okay.
So it's a slight cut, but that's what those continuing resolutions we had for several months because we're halfway
on all 6
on all 12.
All 12.
So we're halfway through the fiscal year.
Right.
The federal fiscal year starts October 1st.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's now the end of April.
Right.
So we're already halfway through the year, and we got halfway through the year on those continuing resolutions.
Got it. Okay.
But if we had failed to pass either a continuing resolution or a spending package this last week, then that's when we go into a shutdown scenario where they start freezing.
Got it. Okay. The continuing resolution was the piece that I was missing. Okay,
yes.
Got it.
Yeah. So if we'd have gone into a shutdown, and we've had government shutdowns before. I mean, in our lifetime, we've had, I think, 5 of them. I don't know. You might have to fact check me on that one, but we've had several.
Jeff, you're on.
And usually we go in with some sort of ultimatum. We're shutting down the government until we get X. And so then you've got to hold out while people are panicking because they're not getting paid and government websites are down or whatever.
Right.
Until you get X. We didn't have an X this time. We didn't have anything that we were saying, if we shut down, we're holding line until this thing happens. It was just a general anger with the bill. And I looked through the bill and I felt like there were some things in there that were worth voting yes for. There's always going to be a reason to vote no. Just to be clear, any spending bill, I mean, we're funding the government from now until the end of September.
Yeah.
It's going to be a big number. And there's always going to be something in there that you don't like that you want to vote no over. But I'm just going to open I've got some notes here. I want to make sure I get this part right. So the things that made me decide that I was willing to vote yes on this bill, that isn't the bill I would have wanted. It's not a perfect scenario.
While you pull that up, so Jeff's got, the first shutdown back to 1975. This seems, in all my research, 1974, 1975, and Richard Nixon seems to be the start of all of the problems we have in this country. Like from the gold standard to the Congress getting confusing with the budgets. So we have multiple shutdowns. So
ideas were pretty. His nuclear ideas were pretty good, though.
Yeah, well, we didn't do them anyway, so it doesn't matter.
So this is Axios. So I mean,
One.
You know,
So each one of those, 1, 2, 3,
Yeah, seems
4,
to be
5,
legit.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 times since 1975, and multiple shutdowns in
But
some
I think,
of those years.
And Celeste, maybe you have an opinion on this. The actual definition of government shutdown. I mean,
Yeah.
Partial
It
shutdown
varies.
versus full shutdown.
Yeah, I mean, I
Right.
remember when I was in college, my first year of college in 2005, the government shut down and we couldn't get into Gettysburg when I was in college. But like,
Yeah.
it's not listed on here. You know what I mean?
Well, and there's like you say, varying levels of shutdown, and it kind of depends on who's in the White House. So when we had the shutdown during the Obama administration, they went super dramatic and like tried to make it hurt as many Americans as they could so that they could get the wins they wanted.
Yeah, twist there.
When
yeah.
we had the shutdown during the Trump era, they tried to keep as many things operating as they could so that we could hold out and get what Republicans wanted. So yeah, not all shutdowns are created equally.
Yeah. So what you were looking for?
I can't find the list I'm trying to find, so we might have to just
That's okay.
do a quick edit at the end. And
Yeah.
But some of the things that, the Hyde Amendment, it says that no federal funds can be used for abortion. We got that in all 6 bills. I don't think we'd have the leverage with a 1-vote majority in the House and Democrats holding the Senate and the White House to come out of a shutdown with that still in there. And
is that because the states are passing bills to give their own support to abortions? I mean,
no,
is it?
It's just because the abortion issue is so controversial right now that it's something that Democrats want to beat us up on, and some Republicans are scared to make it a big issue because it's a tough one to run on. But we kept that rider in there, and that's a really big win. It's a huge conservative win. We also got cuts in 10 of the 12 bills, but the 2 that are increased are Homeland Security, and that's because there's increased funding in there for Border Patrol agents, for ICE detention beds, for new technologies on the border, which is one of the things when I was in Arizona, that's what they desperately need is new technologies on the border and the federal government to pull its weight when it comes to that. But for years, we've had this parity between defense and non-defense spending. So anytime you increase defense spending, non-defense spending has to increase the same amount. One of the biggest wins in this bill that people are not talking about enough is that Speaker Johnson went in and negotiated breaking that parity in a really narrow House majority without the Senate, without the White House. He managed to negotiate a deal where we didn't have to increase non-defense spending. We're behind in defense spending. We needed to give the troops a raise. They haven't had a meaningful raise in 20 years. But we also really need to be investing in our military technology. China is not being shy about the fact that they're trying to outpace us with military technology. And that's the kind of war they're planning on running if they ever have to go to war with us. We've got to keep up. And in a CR, a continuing resolution scenario, we're not. We can't increase that. So this bill did increase that, but we did it while cutting all of the other areas. And that's going to pay off for generations probably.
I can't help but think we spend more on defense spending than the bottom, like behind us, the next 10 countries combined.
But do we really know what China spends on defense spending? I mean, we have no way of knowing. They're not honest in their accounting. They're not honest in what they tell the rest of the world.
So if that's the case, then are we allowing Chinese propaganda to worry us into having to spend more money when we might not necessarily need to spend money on it?
No, I don't think so. I think we're allowing the fact that we live in a really dangerous world to spur us on to doing the research that we need to be doing, to developing the new technologies that we need to be developing, while we're cutting in other areas. We also clawed back a lot of the COVID funds. We clawed back a lot of the IRA funds. We cut funding to UNRWA. Remember the UN branch that helped Hamas invade Israel? We cut their funding. We cut funding to the Wuhan Institute in China. I mean, these are conservative wins that we've been fighting for, that we've been arguing for. We cut climate change funding for climate change initiatives in the military. We cut DEI funding for the military. We ended the vaccine mandate in the military. Some of the things that we have been really big on in conservative circles for the last few years, we got wins on those things in our spending bills that were made up of appropriations bills that have been through a regular markup process.
Yeah.
So while they weren't great bills, and it was a tough call, and I'm not going to criticize any of my colleagues who voted the other way, that's how I arrived at the conclusion that it was worth passing these spending bills. and then getting back to work immediately on some of the things we couldn't fix in this bill, because we are right back in the appropriation cycle for 2025.
Well, it seems like a lot of the things you listed, this is just what pops into my head. A lot of those things are things that shouldn't have been passed in the first place, right? So it's like we're still on the.
So just to be clear, a lot of those things I just listed are policies that come out of the administration. They're not things that came out of Congress. This is Congress battling back bad policies coming out of the executive branch. Yeah.
So and that's the hard thing too, is that if we spend our time battling each other, right, rather than leading with, what is it that we're allowed to do, we're always ended up saying, well, you give them an inch, they take a mile, and then if they'll fix it later. If we're not allowed to do it, then they'll make us stop doing it, right? Yeah. But there's not really any real accountability on the front end to keep us from doing stuff. We just flip. It seems like we flipped the orders. We've given the executive branch so many powers to,
I agree,
execute all these things, and then.
So what I spend a lot of my time on is talking to my colleagues about how we can claw back a lot of that authority from the executive branch. Instead of letting them put bad policies into place and then working to kill the policies, we should be taking back our authority. Almost all of the executive branch is operating on authority that was delegated to them from Congress. Mm-hmm. We're the legislative branch. We shouldn't be delegating all of our authority to agencies that are unaccountable to the people. So we're accountable to the people. We should be making those tough calls, and then they can hold us accountable instead of us passing it off to an executive branch agency and then crying foul when they do something we don't like.
So you voted for the TikTok bill, though, right?
I did.
And doesn't that give all of the power to the president of the United States to
do
decide?
One specific thing, to require social media apps that are owned by a foreign company to be divested?
Or if they have the sole authority to investigate other companies, they have the sole authority to decide whether or not a company is following their criteria, which is as broad of criteria as you can. Like, I think it boils it down to being influenced by an adversary. So they'd have to.
But it only applies to social media apps or a website that runs a social media app. So
or
it's
the app store, the store in which, so like it kind of opens up like Google Play and Apple. So like they are liable as well. So he can investigate any of the stores that are allowing that app to be downloaded as well, right?
Can investigate, but that's all they can do. Then they've got to take that investigation to somebody else.
But still all the executive authority. None of it comes to the legislature. None of it comes to Congress as far as the investigatory piece of it.
Because we don't have a Department of Justice. There's no Congress Department of Justice. Mm-hmm. Department of Justice is executive. But this is Congress telling the executive branch that they have to do something about this.
That they have to do it.
Yeah.
And so I just can't help but think that gives authority to them to investigate essentially any company, any technology company, because it's like a website, right?
But only a website that's associated with a social media platform is trying to influence. And look,
what's the definition of social media platform?
Let me tell you what happened that week. And maybe we need to clean some of this up, but let me tell you what that week was like.
Yeah, that policy, the whole thing seems like we could have done it a million other different ways. And this one, I was like, why did they go this route? And then it was overwhelmingly voted for by everybody.
Yeah. So TikTok put out a push ad that week and told all of their users, Congress is going to take away TikTok. And my phones were ringing all week with distraught teenagers who were threatening to commit suicide because they wouldn't be able to be on TikTok anymore. And if any company has that kind of control over how our kids are thinking, I mean, I know they're harvesting information, they're sending it to the Chinese Communist Party. The reason this whole TikTok thing got legs is because they're taking information about Americans, sending it straight to the Chinese Communist Party. And we're saying, if you want to make your little videos on TikTok, that's great, but the information shouldn't be going to China. That's what we're trying to break. Not your ability to be on TikTok, but the ability of TikTok to send your information straight to China. But if you had any doubt that these social media platforms like TikTok have a huge amount of control over how your kids think, you should have been answering phones in my office that week, because we had kids absolutely losing it. And we tried to handle it really well in my office. You know, we made sure they knew about the 988 suicide hotline. We treated all of them like they were
serious.
Serious, because you have to treat it like it's serious. And we explained the bill to them, and we encouraged them to stay involved in politics and to keep calling about things that matter to them. Because part of me is kind of proud of all these kids for getting involved. But it's terrifying that a social media company that we know is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party can put out a push notification like that, and American teenagers respond en masse.
Yeah.
So we've got to do something. We have a problem sitting right here in our own houses, and we can't just ignore it.
Right, but doing something versus doing the right thing.
Sure.
And so that's
So what do you think the right thing would have been? Because there's always a reason to vote no. I mean, I know I'm going to keep saying that, but it's true. I've never seen a perfect bill yet. But what do you think would have been the right response?
I think that's a good question. I don't think I am necessarily qualified to give the exact details. However, when I think of the precedent that it sends to what the definition of controlled by an adversary of some kind, which are defined separately outside of the bill, and subject to change as well, we start opening up where these policies then that the president gets to then implement and let bureaucrats do, because we don't write legislation that's sound. It gives the door open for the president to go take an extra mile that then we have to then respond to, kind of right back to where we were at the start of this, right? Where it's like, we need to make sure that the policies are being passed that we're okay with and what aren't. But if we write bad legislation, then we're just setting ourselves up for another battle later on.
Well, I agree with you there. We do need to write better legislation. We need to write more detailed legislation and not leave the details up to the
Because I would rather say, let's not rush to making a law just for the sake of making a law versus writing the right law. And if it takes a minute to get it right, then we get it right.
I agree with you there. When there's a bill on the floor, I can vote yes or no. And I felt like voting yes on that one was the right thing to do. The subset of social media companies that are controlled by a foreign adversary is pretty small. And I understand your argument about how you define these things. The lawyer in me also is concerned about how you define terms, because that's how things get implemented. But as I've been out talking to people, I have had a lot of people ask me about, like, why are we giving the government the authority to go in and investigate somebody's private company? Well, we didn't. We gave them the authority to look into companies that are controlled by foreign adversaries. Mm-hmm. And make no mistake, that's not a private company. If the Chinese Communist Party is controlling it, it is in no way a private company. Mm-hmm. And so that's a line that we're going to have to draw between investigating a private company and how they do things and one that is just an arm of a foreign adversary. Because
this is the second piece of this, which I don't feel like is addressed at all. So if the data being received by this app is collecting data that's outside of the terms of use of Apple or Google, then they should be liable to make sure that this app isn't sending, some kind of data, right? Because all of this is hearsay, truthfully, right? Because there's like a couple news articles that have exposed this, but there's only like classified briefings to Congress about what China is actually doing. So a lot of it's just kind of like we're kind of imagining what they could be sending, right? Because like I talked about kitty litter, and all of a sudden I was getting ads about kitty litter or whatever it might be, right? Yeah. So it seems like we're operating based off of not enough information. That's kind of how it feels. And if Apple's letting TikTok listen to us when we're not actually in the app, then that should go against the use of Apple, right?
Okay, but who's going to hold him liable? It's going to be the executive branch.
But it's not the legislation doesn't approach that problem, right?
Well, it's
like not enough.
That's the reason that they have to divest, because they're sharing information. And it's not that you were talking about kitty litter. It's also where you live, what you consume. They have a profile on you now, and what you do online and who you interact with and who your friends are.
And national companies have, like Google and Apple and Meta, they all have that same ability
Google,
too, right?
Apple, and Meta don't have armies.
Maybe. I saw Mark Zuckerberg's yacht. I was like, dang, that thing's huge. Put missiles on that thing. Yeah. No, but you're right.
I'm also concerned with the amount of information that private companies have about all of us. But this is a separate problem from that. This isn't about targeting ads to you. This is about harvesting your information and send it to a foreign adversary.
So it just seems to me like this is a piece, but we're not really tackling like what are the real issues like across the board, right? Because whether it's a foreign adversary or a local adversary, right? Because at the end of the day, I don't know what Google ultimately wants to do, right? They might not have an army, but as far as what they want to accomplish and taking out competition and, different antitrust issues that come into play, and they're keeping out competitors, all that stuff. All of those things to me are concerning, where it seems like we're just not tackling what the fundamental problems are with some of these technology companies. And we're hitting the surface stuff that's headline stuff, but we're not actually getting into the weeds of it. And that's the thing that kind of is a little bit frustrating for me.
So I'm going to try to redefine what you just said. We're tackling the easy stuff. The one thing we can all agree on is we don't want China harvesting our data. When it comes down to a private company harvesting our data, then we've got a wider variety of opinions on what to do about it. And to your earlier point, if we're going to start, and this isn't if, I'm not saying we should, but if we're going to start getting into what private companies can and can't do to collect data, then that's something we've got to take more time on. We've got to know exactly what we're doing, what we're talking about, and have broad consensus on it, because now we're messing with a company's ability to do business and their private capital. But the easier things, the things we can more easily agree on, is we don't want foreign adversaries doing it. So we'll tackle that first. That's a separate problem than is Alexa listening to you when you haven't summoned her in your home.
Yeah, which I know she is. I know she is. I know it. Going back just to because there's been lots of bills, right, that you voted on.
Yeah.
On the appropriations bill, just kind of back to this. What were some of the things that stuck out to you? You're like, these are the hardest pills that you had to swallow.
Yeah. So,
because I think it's fair to say just because you voted yes doesn't mean you agreed with everything, right?
No,
that there's
definitely
some
not.
nuance in here. So what were those points where you're like, man, this one's tough? Yeah.
Some of those points are some of the things that I get asked about a lot. So everybody wants to talk about the earmarks that are in the bills. And just to be clear, I think a lot of times people use the term earmark and pork barrel interchangeably.
I said pork belly last time.
which was adorable. Sorry, I called you out on that. I should have just let you do it.
No.
But when they talk about the earmarks in this bill, it's not pork barrel spending. These are within the budget that an agency's given. Congress is saying this 1% of it should be used this way. This is Congress's way of controlling the purse strings and saying, if you're going to be doing a grant program, then we want you to prioritize these things that are important in our districts.
In the last conversation, we talked about the statutory authority. Is this going back to that?
Well, no, I'm just going to some of the examples of some of those earmarks that other members of Congress have put in are some of the hardest pills to swallow.
Yeah.
So, a really liberal member of Congress is going to try to earmark things in their state that I find really objectionable.
Right.
And once Congress has the ability to tell agencies how to spend their funds, 435 members of Congress are going to have very different ideas about what's a priority.
Right.
The things in this district that we prioritized are things like municipal drinking water systems, rural roads that are out on public land where they don't have taxes to pay for the roads. This isn't exactly bread and circuses we're talking about here.
Yeah.
These are the basic things that a local government is required to do, and they struggle to do in Utah because we have so much public land that we're not getting taxes on. And so I actually inherited most of these from Chris Stewart, but I worked on them there too. I prioritize things that help local governments do the things that local governments are required to do.
Right.
Making sure we clear some of the hurdles for them to do that, and sometimes funding as well. But the most objectionable things in those bills were the things like that really liberal members did for their districts.
Right.
Like a homeless shelter for trans youth, or I can't remember, but a lot of the things people keep talking about that are in this bill, they're actually those kind of things. It's that some member of Congress said, in my district, this is a top priority.
And so they got funding from that because it's allowed, essentially, as long as if it gets plugged in there, it's allowed to go through.
Yeah.
Can you go into those and fight individual earmarks? Like, how does that work? Within committee, I guess.
You can within committee, and that's where that has to happen. And that's why a lot of people are like, we can't read everything that's in these bills, because they didn't get involved at the committee process. And then when it comes to the floor, they get caught off guard. And there are groups out there that are brilliant about going in and finding every single one of those and compiling them and saying, this is what this bill's made up of. And they're not wrong. Those things are in the bill. And that's part of the messy process of having a legislative body that's made up of 435 people. You're going to have people with different priorities,
and you're dealing with
that end up in the same bill.
Over $1 trillion worth of money. There's a lot of things to be spent on.
Yes,
there's a lot of things to spend on.
Yeah.
Well, I thought one of the notable things was there was a significant cut to the FBI, ATF.
Yes.
And EPA. There was a lot of cutting there.
And IRS.
And the
that's
IRS.
a big one.
So just on the fun side now, but we're not really back to pre-COVID levels of spending here still,
No.
right? We're still far away from that. Somebody posted that they're funding a new FBI headquarters, like $200 million for FBI headquarters. I don't know if that was in there or not.
That's been a knockdown, drag-out fight for several years, and it's been interesting. This is just an aside, but I just think most people will find it interesting. The FBI, I think they got authority for a new headquarters. I don't even know how many years ago, but it's been several years ago. But there's been a fight between Maryland and Virginia about where to build it. Because wherever you build the headquarters, you're going to have a lot of new jobs.
Right.
You're going to have a lot of people buying homes in that area. And so they've been fighting over who gets the new FBI headquarters, which I just think is interesting. I don't think most states want FBI headquarters in their state, but
apparently
Virginia and Maryland do.
Apparently they do, because it goes back to the jobs, right? Yep. And this is one of those double-edged swords. You could cut federal spending, but federal spending is what props up a lot of economic forces, right? When you're talking about plugging $1 trillion into the economy directly, cutting those things there's time where that has to get reabsorbed into a private sector, right? And so there's this, we're kind
and there has to be a ramp down. I mean, I want less spending, but I'm reading Rob Bishop's book. I think it's called The Things They Never Taught Me in School I Learned in Congress, or something really close to that. I might not be getting it exactly right. But it was interesting to me that, and I do not get any sort of royalty for telling people about this book.
Fair enough.
But he used a quote in there from Ezra Taft Benson, who, obviously was a prophet of my faith, but was also the Secretary of Agriculture in the Eisenhower administration. And he was talking about government spending. And he said, if you're on a hijacked plane, when you get control of the plane, you don't immediately cut the engines. You turn it around and bring it back in safely for a landing. And that's what I'm working to do right now. And I know a lot of people would like to see us just cut the engines. But the reality is, with the federal spending that we've had, there are families who, depend on these jobs for a living. There are state agencies that don't have these regulations in place because the federal government's been doing it. There are things that we've got to replace. A lot of them we can just remove, but there are things we have to replace, and we have to ramp down off of them. If you suddenly cut the engines, we're going to experience a crash. What we need to do is safely turn this around and bring it back in for a safe landing. So I'm willing to keep taking incremental cuts, and we're all going to have to feel the pain at some point. We all have way more federal government in our lives than we need. And as we cut that back, there are going to be things we'll have to learn to live without. There will be federal programs that our schools don't get. There will be federal programs that, our community programs don't get. And we're just going to have to keep cutting it back and learning to live without it until we can safely land this.
So maybe to help just be direct, The Things I Learned in Congress They Never Taught in School by Rob Bishop.
Yes.
Forward by Senator Mike Lee.
It's great airplane reading.
Yeah. From October 2023. That might be one I'm going to have to download and listen to that one.
I'll even let you borrow mine when I finish it.
Okay, sweet. So it seems like there's an opportunity here, though, too, to give clarity. I think an interesting strategy, which Jeff and I talked about, going into this, your three big rocks: fighting inflation, budget, and overreach. Those were your campaign fights. And if I'm just I don't know anything about anything, which is pretty much already how we've all established where I'm at. And I look, and
I don't think we've established that. You're doing a great job.
And the votes, and the majority of the bills that have come across, you voted yes on. There's very few that you voted no on. Is that fair to say?
I've cast a lot of no votes, but I've probably cast more yeses.
More yeses. So thinking of the opinion that you're not doing any of those things potentially, right?
Yeah.
What were the things, like, if you could just cut the engines and land the plane safely still, like what to you, what is it that it really is important to you that if you could, you would do this, but it's not that simple. We're playing 3D chess.
So if I could just get rid of the federal government controlling land in states, I would do that. I'd do that
First.
tomorrow. If I get rid of things like the Department of Education, the states should be in charge of that. We don't need a federal program for that. I'd get rid of that. Even things like, a lot of the social programs, the social safety net programs. If I could just get rid of them, I would. But the reality is we've got people who are dependent on those. And if we just cut the engines, we're going to have some human tragedies. So let's turn the plane around fix it incrementally. And that's why I voted no on all the CRs. The CRs were keeping policies in place. We were spending money, and we were spending according to the Pelosi Congress's policy priorities.
Right.
And so I said no to those. I said I'd rather vote on spending bills, even if they're not perfect spending bills, than continue all these policy priorities from the last Congress. So now we have our policy priorities in place, and we can get to work on spending less.
And then I'll give you credit too. We were able to get it into two sections and tackle each appropriation bill individually rather than this massive one.
Yep.
All it being, given to everybody by the final hour. Is it essentially that? Is that you're literally getting the stack in the final hour, or you're just like, I'm having to pay attention to this committee and this committee and this committee and this committee, and I'm paying attention as they're going through it, and then the final one, there was last minute red lines, and that's really what I'm getting updated on. Is that how the process goes?
Yes, that's how the process goes.
It's so funny that you just get what they tell you is happening isn't actually what's happening.
And there are a lot of incentives to tell the story a certain way, right? Almost everybody who's telling you the story has an incentive to tell the story their way.
Right.
Even within our conference, we have a lot of conservatives who said all along what they wanted was spending bills. And then when we got spending bills, they voted no and did some messaging on how awful it was. Because it's always easier to message negatively. Always. Yeah. If you say something nice about something, you have to defend that. If you say something negative, no one ever asks any questions. No one has any follow-up. So it's always easier to vote no. It's always easier to throw rocks. It's always easier to be negative. And, there are going to be times I'm probably going to be doing that. But sometimes you just have to stand there and say, this is why I did it. And I hope that people, even people who disagree with my votes, will at least give me credit that I come back and explain what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I tell people this is why I did it. This is the logic I used. And the reason it matters to me that I get credit for that is because I really believe that is how representation is supposed to work. If I represent people, they're not going to agree with me all the time. Anyone who tells you they agree with you on everything is lying to you. But I want people to know how I'm representing them and how I arrive at these conclusions, because that really matters to me. And then when it comes time to vote again, they'll know whether they like me or not. I'm not going to win over everybody. I know that. But everybody will know how I'm making decisions on their behalf. And that really matters to me. But it is so much easier to just throw out talking points and throw red meat and sort of ride whatever wave is happening that day.
Yeah. And I think that's been a huge strategy with both the extreme sides of both parties, right? So the left and the right run that same game plan. And so I couldn't help but think, I told Jeff this, I was like, she should just vote no on everything, knowing that she's going to have to be re-up for a re-election, and be like, see, I'm doing everything I can, even though. That
is a strategy.
And so I will say you could have done that.
I could have.
But that's disingenuous. That's not who you are.
Right.
And so I think so one could say, oh, it's because you're influenced by the establishment. You have people that are twisting your arm.
They also do say that.
They do say that, right? They could say that. I've never said that. Also, because it's too hard for me to really have an opinion. I think anybody who says I know this to be a fact, they're probably missing some element of it.
I can tell you, I've never had anybody like twist my arm and tell me I have to vote a certain way. In fact, it's kind of ironic when I'm here. I have a lot of people say, "Are you tough enough to stand up to leadership?" But then they don't want me to be tough enough to stand up to them. They want me to just do whatever they think I should do, but I should be independent-minded when it comes to leadership in Washington, D.C. I'm trying to make sure that I'm being tough and independent-minded with everybody and doing what I think is best for the people of the 2nd District, no matter what kind of pressure I get. I'm listening to my constituents. I'm trying to respond to their concerns, but I'm not just rubber stamping any groups within the Republican Party either or leadership. And I also want to make sure that I'm not disingenuous when I vote no, so that when I vote no, it does mean something. I don't want to game the voting. There was a lot of talk last Congress on the funding bills about, the vote no, hope yes strategy. And there was a lot of ink spilled over that. I don't want to be a vote no, hope yes. If I think yes is the right answer, I'm going to vote yes. If I'm voting no, it's because I think it's a bad idea. And then my constituents know where I actually stand on things, and they can hold me accountable for where I actually am, instead of trying to read between the lines, look behind my votes and see what I'm doing. I'm just going to tell them what I'm doing.
Yeah. So thinking about Washington County in particular, representing the 2nd District.
Yeah.
What you got a lot of road between here and November anyway, but what are the big projects? What are these other projects? Appropriations. Now it sounds like that's all been voted on.
Well, only until September. So we're
Until
doing
September.
that again before November.
So what else? What are these other projects that you've latched onto, gotten into the weeds in? What are some of the other things that nobody's talking about that you're taking care of?
Well, so one of the big ones is FISA. We talk about FISA all the time. I talk about FISA every day.
We talked about that on the defense bill.
Yeah.
Bill. That was a big trade-off for you. Is that there was the defense bill that passed, but this FISA sunsetting and the small extension was
we only
worth
have
trading for.
A couple of weeks now, a few weeks to get that amended. I think we're there. I was on the phone this morning about where the two committee chairmen are, and I think we've reached it. Actually, I think Senator Lee offered up the amendment that's going to be the saving grace on these two bills that they couldn't get aligned. And so I think we're in a good place there. And a lot of local issues, local to Washington County. So I've spent a lot of time on the Northern Corridor. I mean, it's something that the county's been working on for 2 decades now. It's something I worked on when I was at the county. But there are some federal hurdles, and I've worked with the appropriate committees on some of those. Is there like this glaring hurdle that's just, can we like call out the elephant in the room? Yeah.
It's like, this is the hurdle, like this is the obvious one. Because I hear there's like hurdles and we're going through the process, and this is 20 years of doing it. It's like, okay, well, is somebody going to do anything? How long do we just keep saying we're getting there?
No, I'll tell you what the hurdle is. We got a record of decision out of the Department of Interior right at the end of the Trump administration, and the Biden administration rolled back the record of decision. So the record of decision is, the signature you need from the federal government. That's like, yep, we decided this is a good idea. Now we can start moving. They rolled that back.
So that means you got to start all over? Or?
Well, that's what we're fighting. No, we don't want to have to start all over. So I'm working with committees on making sure we don't have to start all over to get a new record of decision. And we're gonna work with the Natural Resources Committee. I'm not on that committee, but they kind of treat me like I am, which is awesome.
You're kind of not on any committee yet because you're in the middle, right?
Oh, I am.
You're in the messy bit.
Okay, I'm on the Small Business Committee, which is really cool. Very relatable, very relevant to everything we do in Utah. And I'm on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which is also relevant to everything we do in Utah. And then I get to do a lot with the Natural Resources Committee. And that's the committee that's overseeing this process. So we're working in committee right now to undo the damage that was done by the administration. So, it's complicated. The history is complicated. There are a lot of moving parts. But if you want to talk about like the point that's causing a problem, it's rolling back that record of decision.
Okay. So then now you're having to go and say, we're getting back in line. There's like some, format that we have to, is there a form that we have to fill out? I don't understand.
If only it were that simple.
I know.
So what we're trying to do is get them to undo that decision of rolling back the record.
Just that. And that means going to who?
To the White House.
So you have to just you're basically in queue to talk to the White House about a specific thing?
No, this isn't we're going to go sit down with the president thing. It's more working with the Department of Interior to get them to change that decision.
Yeah. So it's like...
I'll give you a concrete example of something we're going to do.
I just imagine like the Department of the Interior is like an office building. You walk in and you're like, who do you want to see? And I'm like, I want to see the Department of the Interior.
That is actually how it worked during the Trump administration. When I was a staffer and Trump was in the White House, that's exactly how it worked. I could walk in there and say, I want to see this deputy secretary that's over this.
Yeah.
And I could go in and talk to him, and I'd say, the decision you're making on grazing in Piute County is causing these problems for people in our district. And we've got to do something to fix it. And they'd say, okay, what do you want us to do? And we'd work through that. Right now, it is not like that. I can't go over there and even get an appointment. They say, we're busy. We'll get back to you. I get a letter that says, we're aware of your concerns. We're already working on it.
Man, it's the DMV. It's like the DMV of the federal government. This sounds like a nightmare.
And this is why it really matters who's in the White House, because the administration, we have so much executive branch that the administration has so much control over things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being big federal issues. When a town in Utah wants to upgrade part of their municipal power system. We've got these little hydro power plants all over Utah because we have these beautiful canyons with rivers running down them. And we figured out a long time ago that you can make electricity out of that.
Right.
But now if they want to upgrade a system that's been in place for 100 years, they've got to go through a FERC process. And it just gets bogged down forever. And it gets more and more expensive the longer it takes.
Right.
And these are the kind of things, I talked all the time during the last campaign about One of the reasons I wanted to run for this office is because I've spent so much of my life helping local governments work through these processes that I know how to help cut the red tape. Those are the kind of things that I like doing, because it's not everybody watches cable news and they see the big headlines and people get upset about whatever the issue of the day is. And I'm paying attention to those too, and I'm voting on those. But what really separates a good representative from someone who's just there because of the national issues is being willing to dig in on these local issues and help figure out where the federal pinch points are and help clear the hurdles so that our local governments can do what our local governments are required to do.
Yeah.
We are bogged down all the time when we can't build roads and we can't fix our power lines and we can't build a new pipeline because every one of these things has to go through multiple layers of federal processes that are just so onerous and they don't make any sense. And at the end of the day, if we get the pipeline built or whatever it is we're trying to do, we spend 10 years and millions of dollars and we don't get a better pipeline for that. We get the same pipeline they wanted to build in the first place.
Yeah.
It's not like we get $10 million worth of improvements to the project because we
Right.
go through all these federal processes. We're just doing each other's laundry, so to speak, all the time.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to cut down on. That's what drives me insane about how our government works.
Yeah.
We just have way more government than we need. We have all these regulations that aren't keeping us safe from anything. They're just a way of keeping people employed and keeping the people at the top of these agencies important.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh, it sounds like such a headache. I just can't imagine, like, what would it take, like that point of releasing federal lands to the state of Utah? Would it take it doesn't take an amendment to the Constitution.
No, it would take an act of Congress.
An act of Congress, but
Yeah.
just a bill
Yeah.
that just says this thing, which is
Yep.
50, and you only need 51%.
Yeah.
But both the House and the Senate, and then the president has to sign it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And-
So it sounds simple, but getting 51% of the House to do anything.
And then
is
51% of the Senate,
60 senators.
60 senators.
So
and
that's crazy. And then the president,
And then you
this
gotta get the
president would
president.
veto it.
Yeah, easy.
And so we've got a lot of work to do just to convince people we don't need all the government we have.
Right. Right. It's just insane. So maybe last question, because I know we're just past 2:00.
Okay.
The Colorado River Compact.
Yes.
What is there? Do you have any update on that, or is that still just being handled by the states? And you're
Yeah, so I am the vice chair of the Colorado River Caucus.
Okay.
And the reason I am the vice chair of the Colorado River Caucus is to stay in this conversation and keep reminding my colleagues that we shouldn't get ahead of the states. So there are updates. The states have moved forward. They've sent their plans to the Bureau of Rec. It's going through the federal process, but we're not at the point yet where Congress needs to ratify the decision.
so there's some kind of agreement over there?
Yes.
There's okay, because I know they started the conversation like last fall,
Yeah.
but it doesn't come up for the old compact expires next year
I
or
think 2026.
26.
Yeah.
So they still have some time. So it seems like the states are making progress on
Yeah.
there's not really a whole lot of bog down, at least from what you've heard.
Well, the states have been bogged down, but the states are working through all of their points of disagreement and getting each other to come to the table, and that's just something that's better off happening between the states without
them.
us.
Yeah.
But once they get to their agreement and everybody agrees, and then it's time for Congress to ratify that agreement so that it has the force of law. But we shouldn't be the ones writing it or negotiating it. So
Yeah.
I keep saying the federal government needs to stay out of it, which is
Yeah.
true until we have an agreement. Then the federal government needs to ratify that agreement and not monkey with it.
Yeah. And you feel confident that we have the right people at the seat to be negotiating those things, like
Yeah.
just from what you've
Yeah.
heard and stuff like that? Okay.
I do.
And that's probably a question for the governors. Well, got to get the governors in here.
Yeah.
But okay. Any last thoughts? I know we talked about a lot here. We got into the weeds
Yeah,
quite a bit.
we
on a
got
couple
into
of
the
things.
weeds and we covered things I didn't think we would cover, and we didn't cover things I expected to cover. But this is what I love about podcasts. It gives you kind of
Yeah.
a longer format to talk about things. I guess the last thing I want to cover is just that it really matters who represents you and how they represent you. And I've spent enough time around Congress to see good representation and bad representation. And one of the things I've noticed is you can probably there's a pretty direct correlation between someone who is really good at representing their district, that really cares about their constituents, and someone who spends a ton of time out messaging on whatever the issue of the day
Hot
is.
button.
So one of the rules of thumb, people always ask me, how would you know? How can you tell who's doing a good job and who's not? That's one of the things to watch. Another one is how much time do they spend in their district answering questions? And so because I think those are two of the important issues, I haven't really pursued national media options. I try to spend as much time on podcasts, on local radio, talking to local media as I can. And I try to hold as many events as I can in the district and just be really responsive to people who have questions for me or people who don't even know they have questions, but I'm showing up and saying, here I am. Here's what I'm doing for you. And so that's what I want to close on is that I said when I was campaigning that I wanted to set a new standard for what it means to represent people. And those are the things I'm doing to set a new standard.
Yeah, sweet. I appreciate that. So, well, this is going to air first week in April. So there's like in a week or so.
Fantastic.
When's your next, like if somebody wants to come out and just chat with you about what was said or something was said on this, where was your next event?
So my next event is tonight, so it's before this is going to air. But for someone who's listening to this once it airs, I'm holding teletown halls every week for state delegates because right now we're running in the convention phase. But I'm having regular events and I have a newsletter. So if you want to know what I'm doing, go to my website, my official website, subscribe to the newsletter, and then you'll know when I'm out and about when I'm having events. And I also try to make sure I'm going on the radio and advertising them, and that we try to get them in local papers and make sure people know where I'm going to be, when I'm going to be there so they can come talk to me. And if all of that fails, call my office and say that you would like to hear from me, and I will do my best to return all of those phone calls. There's only so many hours in the day, but I am using them as well as I possibly can.
I believe it. Well, I appreciate you spending time here. Thank you for being on again. This is number 2.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. Good luck in the election.
Thank you.
You got a long timer ahead.
Yep.
But I appreciate the work you do because it's a thankless job in a lot of cases. So keep up the good work. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having a political podcast where people can come and hear long form answers and get good information.
Of course. Sweet. I hope I do an okay job at least.
You're doing a great job.
Thanks. Okay. We'll see you later.
Okay.